The evening air carried a slight chill as Chief Marcus Washington slid his key into the ignition of his personal vehicle, a modest sedan he'd owned for nearly 5 years. The digital clock on his dashboard read 10:47 p.m. Another late night, another community meeting that had run longer than scheduled. He didn't mind. These meetings were essential to his vision for the department. Marcus loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top button of his dress shirt. After 14 hours on duty, he looked forward to the quiet drive home through the sleeping city. 6 months into his role as the first black police chief in the city's history, he was still adjusting to the weight of expectations that came with the position. Tonight's community forum in the East Side neighborhood had been particularly productive, tense at times, but ultimately respectful. Progress, he muttered to himself, a small smile crossing his tired face as he pulled out of the nearly empty parking lot. The city streets were quiet on this Tuesday night. Marcus drove carefully, his mind reviewing action items from the meeting. The East Side residents had legitimate concerns about over-policing in their neighborhood. The statistics backed up their complaints. A disproportionate number of traffic stops and citations issued to black and Hispanic drivers compared to white drivers in similar situations. Marcus had inherited these problems, but he was determined to address them. He had plans for new training programs, community oversight committees, and revised protocols for traffic stops. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was committed to the long road ahead. His phone buzzed with a text message. At the next red light, he glanced down to see a message from his wife. "Don't forget milk." He smiled, appreciating this ordinary reminder in a job filled with extraordinary pressures. The light turned green, and Marcus continued down Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, passing through neighborhoods he'd known his entire life. Born and raised in this city of 300,000, he had worked his way up through the ranks of the police department over 22 years. His appointment as chief had been celebrated by many, but viewed with skepticism by others, both within the department and throughout the community. Some veteran officers quietly questioned whether his promotion was based on merit or politics. Meanwhile, many community activists wondered if any police chief, regardless of race, could truly reform a system they viewed as fundamentally flawed. Marcus understood both perspectives. He had experienced racism within the force as a young officer. He had also witnessed the deep distrust many citizens felt toward police, including members of his own family. This unique position, understanding both sides, was precisely why the mayor had selected him for the job. As he turned onto Oakwood Drive, Marcus noticed headlights flashing in his rearview mirror. A patrol car had appeared behind him, signaling for him to pull over. He checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His registration and insurance were current, and his taillights had been working fine earlier. With the practiced calm of a veteran officer, Marcus signaled and pulled to the curb. He lowered his window and placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel, a habit born from personal experience and professional knowledge. Even as police chief, Marcus never forgot the reality of being a black man during a traffic stop. In his rearview mirror, he watched as an officer emerged from the patrol car. The beam of a flashlight swept across his rear window. Marcus squinted against the glare but could make out the silhouette of a tall, broad-shouldered officer approaching with a hand resting near his holstered weapon. Marcus didn't recognize the officer, which wasn't unusual in a department of nearly 400. As the beam of light swept across his face, Marcus remained perfectly still, his breathing measured. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone unnecessarily harsh and authoritative. Marcus noticed the officer's name tag. Brennan. Officer James Brennan. The name was familiar, a relatively new transfer from a smaller department in a neighboring county. Marcus had reviewed his file during his routine assessments of recent transfers but hadn't met him personally. "Good evening, Officer Brennan," Marcus replied calmly, maintaining eye contact. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The flashlight beam remained fixed on Marcus's face, the glare making it difficult to read Brennan's expression. There was a moment of tense silence before Brennan responded. "Your left taillight is out, and you crossed the center line back there on Maple Street." Marcus knew with absolute certainty that neither of these things was true. His car had just passed inspection last week, and he had definitely not swerved on Maple Street. In that moment, Chief Marcus Washington made a decision. "Sir, I need to see your license and registration now," Officer Brennan repeated, his voice growing more impatient. The beam of his flashlight remained fixed on Marcus's face, creating harsh shadows across the car's interior. Marcus maintained his calm. "I'm going to reach for my wallet in my back pocket," he said clearly, moving his right hand slowly from the steering wheel. He had done this stance before, announcing every movement to avoid any misunderstandings. Officer Brennan shifted his weight, standing slightly behind the driver's door. Standard procedure to maintain tactical advantage. His posture remained tense, his free hand still hovering near his weapon. "Make it quick," Brennan said sharply. As Marcus carefully extracted his wallet, he made a mental note of Brennan's demeanor. The officer's approach was textbook in one sense, maintaining control of the situation, but his tone and aggression level were disproportionate for a routine traffic stop. This was exactly the kind of interaction Marcus had been discussing at tonight's community meeting. "Here's my license," Marcus said, handing it over. "The registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach over to get it now." Brennan took the license but didn't immediately look at it, keeping his eyes fixed on Marcus's movements. As Marcus leaned toward the glove compartment, Brennan's flashlight followed him, tracking his every motion. "What are you doing out this late?" Brennan asked, the question loaded with suspicion. "This isn't really a neighborhood for cruising around after hours." Marcus paused, registration papers now in hand. The comment struck him as particularly revealing. This was a middle-class residential area, and it was barely 11 o'clock, hardly after hours. What exactly did Brennan mean by suggesting he didn't belong here? "I live 3 blocks from here," Marcus replied evenly, handing over the registration. "I'm on my way home from work." Brennan finally glanced down at the license in his hand. His expression changed instantly. The confident authority in his face faltered, giving way to confusion, then shock, and finally something close to fear as he recognized the name. "Chief Washington?" he stammered, the flashlight beam dropping away from Marcus's face for the first time. "That's right, Officer Brennan," Marcus confirmed, his voice neutral. Brennan straightened up immediately, his entire demeanor transforming. "Sir, I didn't recognize you in civilian clothes. I apologize for the confusion." Marcus observed the sudden shift with interest. The officer's voice had risen almost an octave, the aggressive edge completely gone. His hand had moved away from his weapon, and his posture had changed from intimidating to almost deferential. "May I ask again why you pulled me over?" Marcus asked. "You mentioned a taillight and crossing the center line." Brennan swallowed visibly. It appeared from my vantage point that your left taillight was dimmer than the right, sir, and there was a slight weave in your driving pattern." Marcus nodded slowly. "Officer Brennan, I'd like you to walk back to your patrol car and take another look at my taillights. Both of them, then come back and tell me what you see." Confusion flickered across Brennan's face, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." As Brennan retreated to his patrol car, Marcus watched in the rearview mirror. The officer stood behind Marcus's sedan, staring at the perfectly functional taillights. Even from this distance, Marcus could see the officer's shoulders slump as the reality of the situation dawned on him. When Brennan returned to the driver's window, his face was flushed with embarrassment. "Both taillights are functioning normally, sir," he admitted, avoiding eye contact. "I know," Marcus said, "and I didn't cross any center line on Maple Street, so I'm curious why you really pulled me over, Officer Brennan." Brennan shifted uncomfortably. I thought." He trailed off, unable to formulate an acceptable explanation. Marcus studied the young officer. Brennan was probably in his early 30s, with a military-style haircut and the build of someone who spent considerable time at the gym. His personnel file had shown a clean record at his previous department, though Marcus now wondered if that department had simply failed to document problematic behavior. "Officer Brennan, I'd like you to turn off your body camera," Marcus said after a moment. Brennan looked startled. "Sir?" "Turn it off. What happens next doesn't need to be on record. Not yet, anyway." Brennan hesitated, then reached up to his chest and disabled the camera. The small red recording light blinked out. "Thank you," Marcus said. He turned off his engine and removed his keys. "Now, I think you and I need to have a conversation, a real one. Why don't you get in the passenger seat?" Brennan's eyes widened in alarm. "Sir, I don't think that's. Officer Brennan slid into the passenger seat of Chief Washington's car with visible reluctance. His body language spoke volumes, shoulders tense, hands resting awkwardly on his knees, eyes fixed straight ahead rather than looking at Marcus. The interior light cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting beads of sweat forming along his hairline. Marcus turned slightly in his seat to face the officer. The small confines of his sedan created an intimate space that left nowhere for either man to hide. For several long moments, neither spoke. The only sounds came from the occasional passing car and the faint static of the police radio in Brennan's patrol vehicle. 3 years ago, Marcus finally began, his voice calm but firm. I was driving home from my sister's birthday dinner. I was a captain then. A patrol officer pulled me over, claimed I had a broken taillight. Just like you did tonight. He paused, letting the parallels sink in. When I got home, I checked. All my lights were perfect. Brennan swallowed but remained silent. 2 years before that, I was stopped for matching the description of a suspect. Before that, for suspicious driving patterns. Marcus counted off each incident on his fingers. I'd been pulled over 17 times in this city while off duty. 17 times without a single valid reason. Sir, I wasn't. Brennan started. Let me finish. Marcus cut him off. I'm not sharing this for sympathy. I'm sharing it because I need you to understand something fundamental. When you pulled me over tonight, you didn't see Police Chief Marcus Washington. You saw a black man in a car who didn't belong in this neighborhood. Isn't that right? The direct question hung in the air between them. Brennan's jaw tightened, his eyes still fixed forward. Officer Brennan, look at me, Marcus said. When Brennan finally turned, Marcus continued. This conversation stays between us for now, but only if we're honest with each other. Why did you really pull me over tonight? Brennan exhaled slowly. I was patrolling the area. I saw a vehicle I didn't recognize. The driver was, he hesitated. Black. Marcus finished for him. Brennan nodded almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a conscious thing, I just noticed you. Then I started looking for a reason to check things out. You profiled me, Marcus said, his tone not accusatory but matter of fact. I was doing my job, Brennan countered, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. This neighborhood has had break-ins recently. I'm supposed to be vigilant. And you pull over every unfamiliar vehicle, or just the ones with black drivers? The question hit its mark. Brennan fell silent again, his internal struggle plainly visible on his face. Marcus reached into the back seat and retrieved a folder he'd brought home from work. I've been reviewing traffic stop data for the past 6 months, since I became chief. He opened the folder and handed Brennan a printout. These are your numbers, Officer Brennan. In 6 months, 72% of the drivers you pulled over have been people of color, in a city where they make up 34% of the population. Brennan stared at the paper, his brow furrowed. These could be explained by patrol areas, time of day. I've accounted for those variables, Marcus interrupted. Your numbers are statistical outliers, even within your assigned zones and shifts. So what now? Brennan asked, an edge of defiance in his voice. You're going to make an example of me? End my career over one traffic stop? Marcus shook his head. If I wanted to do that, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Your body camera would still be on, and I'd be calling for a supervisor. Then what do you want? Understanding, Marcus said simply. Do you know why I became a police officer? The question seemed to catch Brennan off guard. No, sir. My uncle was killed by police when I was 12 years old. He reached for his wallet during a traffic stop, and the officer thought he was reaching for a gun. Marcus's voice remained steady despite the weight of the memory. The officer wasn't charged. The department defended him. My family got no justice. Brennan's expression shifted from defensive to confused. And that made you want to become a cop? It made me want to change things from the inside, Marcus clarified. I believe in what policing should be, protecting and serving all communities equally. But that can't happen if officers don't recognize their own biases. I'm not racist, Brennan said, the words coming out automatically. Most people aren't consciously racist, Marcus replied. But we all have biases that affect our decisions. The question is whether we're willing to acknowledge them and work to overcome them. Marcus pointed to another page in the folder. Tomorrow, I'm launching a department-wide review of traffic stop practices. Your data would make you a prime candidate for disciplinary action. The next morning arrived with a sense of purpose as Chief Washington strode through the police station's main entrance. Officers nodded respectfully as he passed, but he noticed their curious glances. Word traveled fast in a police department. By now, most had heard about his late-night encounter with Officer Brennan, though the details remained vague and speculative. Marcus reached his office and closed the door behind him. On his desk sat the folder he had shown Brennan the night before, the initial findings of his traffic stop review. What had started as a hunch was now backed by hard data. The numbers were troubling, revealing patterns that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Lieutenant Garcia, head of internal affairs and one of Marcus's most trusted colleagues, entered with a concerned expression. "Morning, Chief. Heard you had an interesting night." Marcus gestured for her to sit. "News travels fast." "Officer Brennan has been unusually quiet this morning," Garcia observed. "Care to fill me in on what really happened?" Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Brennan pulled me over last night, claimed my taillight was out and that I crossed the center line. Neither was true." Garcia's eyebrows rose. "He didn't recognize you." "Not until he saw my license," Marcus confirmed. "By then, the damage was done." "What are you planning to do about it?" Garcia asked, her tone professional but concerned. As the department's first Latina lieutenant, she understood the complexities of bias in policing better than most. Marcus pushed the folder toward her. "This goes beyond Brennan. Look at the data." Lieutenant Garcia flipped through the pages, her expression growing more serious with each turn. The evidence was clear and damning. Traffic stops across the department showed significant racial disparities that couldn't be explained by demographics or crime patterns alone. "We have a systemic problem," Marcus said. "Brennan is just a symptom." Garcia nodded slowly. "The union won't like what you're about to do." "Probably not," Marcus agreed. "But this isn't about making people comfortable. It's about making our department better." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city he had sworn to protect. "I'm calling an all-hands meeting at noon. I want every officer not actively on patrol to be there." "And Brennan?" Garcia asked. "He'll be there too," Marcus replied. "We had a long talk last night. I think he's ready to hear what needs to be said." As noon approached, tension filled the department's largest conference room. Officers filled every seat, with others standing along the walls. The usual chatter was subdued, replaced by whispered speculations about the purpose of this unexpected gathering. Marcus entered the room last, carrying the data folder and a stack of printed reports. The room fell silent as he took his position at the front. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice firm and clear. "What I'm about to share will be difficult for some of you to hear. But as officers sworn to protect and serve, we must be willing to face uncomfortable truths." He held up the folder. "For the past 6 months, I've been conducting a comprehensive review of our traffic stop practices. The results are concerning." Marcus displayed the first graph on the projector screen behind him. The numbers were stark, showing clear disparities in who was being stopped, searched, and cited across racial lines. "These numbers tell a story," he continued. "A story about who we perceive as suspicious and who we give the benefit of the doubt. It's a story about bias in our department." A murmur spread through the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others crossed their arms defensively. "I want to be clear," Marcus said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This isn't about calling anyone racist. This is about recognizing patterns in our collective behavior that are harming the communities we serve." From his position near the back wall, Officer Brennan watched with a conflicted expression. Just 12 hours ago, he had been forced to confront his own biases in a most personal way. Now, he was witnessing his chief address the entire department with the same direct approach. "Starting today," Marcus announced, "we're implementing mandatory training on bias recognition and de-escalation techniques. We're also revising our protocols for traffic stops to include clearer guidelines on what constitutes reasonable suspicion." Captain Reynolds, a 25-year veteran known for his traditional views, raised his hand. "With all due respect, Chief, are you suggesting we ignore suspicious behavior because we're afraid of looking racist?" The room tensed at the challenging question. Marcus didn't miss a beat. 3 days after the department-wide meeting, Chief Washington sat in his office reviewing the final details of a plan that would either define or destroy his leadership. The manila folder on his desk contained what he was calling the Transparency Initiative, a bold approach to addressing the biases revealed in the traffic stop data. A knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Officer Brennan entered, looking noticeably different from their late-night encounter. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a more thoughtful demeanor. He requested this meeting himself, something Marcus found encouraging. "Take a seat," Marcus offered, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Brennan sat down, his posture stiff. "I've been thinking about our conversation, Chief, and the department meeting." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want to do better. I need to do better." Marcus studied the officer's face, looking for signs of insincerity. He found none. "I'm glad to hear that, Brennan. But change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight." "I know," Brennan nodded. "That's actually why I'm here. I've heard rumors about some kind of public forum you're planning. About the traffic stop data." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Word travels fast." "Is it true?" Brennan asked. "Yes," Marcus confirmed, tapping the folder on his desk. "We're going public with our findings. Full transparency. We'll present the data, acknowledge the problem, and outline our plan to address it." Brennan's face paled slightly. "The whole department will be exposed." "Not individual officers," Marcus clarified. "Just the overall patterns. This isn't about public shaming. It's about public accountability." Brennan shifted in his seat. "The union rep is already talking about fighting this, says it will undermine public trust in police." "The data is already undermining public trust," Marcus countered. "Especially in communities of color. They don't need statistics to tell them what they experience every day." He leaned forward. "Hiding the truth doesn't build trust, Brennan. Acknowledging it does." Silence hummed between them for a moment before Brennan spoke again. "I want to be part of the forum," he said, the words coming out in a rush. Marcus blinked in surprise. "You want to what?" "I want to speak at the public forum," Brennan repeated, more firmly this time. "About what happened that night. About my biases." Marcus leaned back, studying the officer with newfound respect. "That's a big step, Brennan." "Are you sure?" "No," Brennan admitted with a slight laugh, "but it feels like the right thing to do. If we're talking about accountability, I should be accountable for my actions." The community center was packed beyond capacity the following Tuesday evening. Residents from every neighborhood filled the seats, with others standing along the walls. At the front of the room, a panel table had been set up with microphones. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights indicating live broadcasts to the city. Chief Washington approached the microphone, the room falling silent as he prepared to speak. Behind him sat Lieutenant Garcia, two community leaders, and, to many people's surprise, Officer James Brennan in full uniform. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Marcus began. "6 months ago, when I became chief, I promised transparency and accountability. Tonight is about honoring that promise." He proceeded to present the traffic stop data, explaining the clear patterns of racial disparity in simple, straightforward terms. As the graphs appeared on the screen behind him, murmurs rippled through the audience. "These numbers confirm what many in our community have been saying for years," Marcus acknowledged. "There is a pattern of bias in our policing practices that cannot be ignored or explained away." From the audience, a middle-aged black woman stood up. "We've been telling you this for decades. Why should we believe anything will change now?" The question hung in the air, direct and challenging. Marcus nodded respectfully. "You're right to be skeptical," he admitted. "Words mean little without action. That's why I'm not just presenting the problem tonight, I'm presenting our plan to fix it." Marcus outlined the new training programs, revised protocols, and community oversight committee that would monitor progress. As he spoke, he noticed mixed reactions in the audience, hope from some, doubt from others. When he finished, Marcus turned to introduce the next speaker. "Officer James Brennan has asked to address you all directly." A surprised murmur swept through the room as Brennan approached the microphone. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. Officer James Brennan parked his patrol car outside the East Side Community Center and checked his watch. It was 4:30 p.m., exactly the time he had promised to arrive for the youth basketball program. 4 months had passed since the night he had pulled over Chief Washington, and his life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. As he walked toward the entrance, he noticed a group of teenage boys watching him with the wary expressions he had once mistaken for guilt. Before, he would have interpreted their caution as suspicious. Now, he understood it as a learned response to the uniform he wore. "Officer B is here," shouted Darnell, a lanky 14-year-old who had initially been one of Brennan's harshest critics. The boy jogged over, basketball tucked under his arm. "You ready to lose again today?" Brennan laughed. "Don't get cocky. I've been practicing." Inside the community center gym, about 20 young people gathered for the twice-weekly basketball program Brennan had helped establish. What had started as part of his mandated community engagement had evolved into something he genuinely looked forward to. As Brennan changed into gym clothes in the small office, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. Something fundamental had shifted in his expression. The defensive tension he had carried for years had softened. His eyes held a different kind of awareness. The journey hadn't been easy. During his first weeks of community engagement, he had faced open hostility. People questioned his motives, challenged his presence, and rejected his attempts at connection. Some called him a token white cop, sent to make the department look good. "They're never going to accept me," he had complained to Chief Washington after a particularly difficult day. "This isn't working." Washington had simply nodded. "It took generations to create this distrust. Did you really think you could fix it in a few weeks?" That conversation had marked a turning point for Brennan. He realized he had been approaching community engagement as something to complete rather than a relationship to build. He stopped trying to defend himself and started listening instead. He heard stories that unsettled him, accounts of harassment, intimidation, and fear at the hands of officers like himself. He learned about families teaching their children to be afraid of the police, not because they were criminals, but because they were afraid of becoming victims. Most importantly, he began to see the community not as a problem to solve but as people to serve, people with names, stories, and lives as complex as his own. On the basketball court now, Brennan joined a team of younger boys who needed an extra player. The game was loud, energetic, and filled with good-natured trash talk. When Brennan missed an easy shot, the gym erupted in friendly jeers. "Man, Officer B, you're better at writing tickets than shooting hoops," called Marcus Jr., Chief Washington's 16-year-old son who had started attending the program a month earlier. After the game, as the kids were packing up to leave, Brennan noticed a new face, a woman watching quietly from the bleachers. He recognized her as Mrs. Johnson, a community elder who had been particularly vocal about police misconduct at community forums. Brennan approached her cautiously. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Johnson. It's nice to see you here." She studied him with wise, evaluating eyes. "I wanted to see for myself what all the talk was about. People are saying you're different from other officers." Brennan felt an unexpected emotion, not pride, but humility. "I'm trying to be," he admitted. "Still learning." Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. "My grandson says you actually listen when the kids talk. That's rare enough these days." "They have a lot to teach me," Brennan said honestly. As he drove home that evening, Brennan reflected on how much his perspective had changed. 6 months ago, he would have driven through this same neighborhood scanning for threats, categorizing people based on appearance, assuming the worst about ordinary behaviors. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Chief Washington. "Brennan, how'd it go today?" the chief asked. "Good," Brennan replied. "Mrs. Johnson showed up. I think she's still deciding if I'm for real." Washington chuckled. "She doesn't give her approval easily. The fact that she came at all is significant." There was a pause before Washington continued. "The reason I'm calling, there's a department opening for a community liaison officer. Full-time position working with neighborhood groups, schools, and youth programs. I think you should apply." Brennan was stunned. "Me? But there must be officers with more experience, more." "More what?" Washington interrupted. "More understanding of how bias affects policing. More personal experience with transformation. You've done the work, Brennan. Not perfectly, not without setbacks, but consistently. 1 year had passed since that fateful night when Officer James Brennan pulled over Chief Marcus Washington. The anniversary arrived quietly, unmarked on any official calendar, yet deeply significant to both men and the entire department. Chief Washington stood at the podium in the main conference room, reviewing his notes for the press conference scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. The room would soon fill with reporters eager to hear the results of the department's year-long reform initiative. The door opened and Lieutenant Brennan, recently promoted, entered carrying a thick binder of statistics and testimonials. "Final numbers just came in from the data team," Brennan said, handing over the binder. "Thought you'd want to see them before we go public." Marcus flipped through the pages, taking in the graphs and charts that told a remarkable story of transformation. Traffic stop disparities had decreased by 62%. Civilian complaints were down 48%. Community trust ratings had improved across all neighborhoods, most dramatically in areas that had historically reported the highest levels of police tension. "These numbers are better than I expected," Marcus admitted, genuine surprise in his voice. Brennan nodded. "The Community Oversight Committee says the same thing. Even they didn't think we'd see this much change in just 1 year." Marcus closed the binder and studied the man standing before him. Brennan had changed in ways that went beyond his new rank. The defensive arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced by a thoughtful confidence. His promotion to Lieutenant of Community Relations had been met with widespread approval, even from those who had once been his harshest critics. "You know," Marcus said, "when I first offered you that choice a year ago, discipline or education, I wasn't entirely sure you would change." Brennan smiled slightly. "Neither was I." The two men walked together toward the press room, where cameras were being set up and journalists were settling into their seats. "Chief," Brennan said suddenly, stopping in the hallway, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you. That night, when you could have reported me, ended my career, why didn't you?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "Because I didn't become chief to punish officers. I became chief to change policing." He paused. "And because I saw something in you, a capacity for growth that would be wasted if I just fired you." Before Brennan could respond, Mayor Thompson approached from the other end of the hallway. "Gentlemen," the mayor greeted them. "Quite a day. The city council just unanimously approved the budget increase for the expanded training program." This was unexpected good news. The additional funding would allow the department to extend its bias training to all emergency services in the city. "That's the same council that was calling for your resignation 6 months ago," the mayor added with a small smile. "Funny how success changes minds." The press conference began promptly at 2:00 p.m. As Chief Washington presented the results of the year-long initiative, cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes. The story of the department's transformation had already gained national attention, with other cities beginning to implement similar programs based on their model. "These results represent the efforts of many people," Marcus emphasized. "Officers willing to examine their practices, community members willing to engage in difficult conversations, and city leaders brave enough to support meaningful change." When it was Brennan's turn to speak, he approached the podium with quiet confidence. "A year ago, I made a traffic stop that changed my life," he began. "I pulled over a driver because of the color of his skin, not because of any violation. That driver happened to be Chief Washington." The room, though familiar with the story, still fell silent. "What could have been the end of my career became the beginning of real growth, not just for me, but for our entire department." Brennan gestured to a group of officers standing along the wall. "Today, over 40 officers volunteer in community programs similar to the one I started. Not because they're required to, but because they've experienced the same transformation I have." After the press conference, as reporters packed up their equipment and officials exchanged congratulations, Marcus received a text message from his son. "Dad, turn on Channel 7. They're talking about your program." In the break room, a small crowd had gathered around the television. A national news program was featuring a segment on police reform efforts across the country, with their department highlighted as a leading example. The Washington Brennan model, as it's now being called, offers a blueprint for addressing systemic bias in policing, the reporter explained as footage from their community forums played on screen. The morning after the community forum, Chief Washington arrived at his office to find his desk covered with messages. Some were supportive notes from community members impressed by the department's transparency. Others were angry letters from officers who felt betrayed. His phone had been ringing non-stop with calls from other police chiefs across the country, some curious, others critical. Marcus picked up a newspaper with the bold headline, "Police Chief and Officer Make Stunning Admission at Community Forum." Below it was a photograph of him standing beside Officer Brennan, both looking serious as they addressed the packed community center. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Captain Reynolds entered, his expression stormy. As president of the police union, he represented the most traditional faction of the department. "This has gone too far, Chief," Reynolds said without preamble, tossing a copy of the newspaper onto the desk. "You've hung the entire department out to dry. Officers are demoralized." Marcus gestured for him to sit. "I understand your concerns, Reynolds, but hiding our problems won't solve them." "You're making targets of us all," Reynolds argued, remaining standing. "We already have one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. Now you're telling the public we're all biased." "I'm telling the public we recognize a problem and we're fixing it," Marcus corrected him. "That builds trust, not erodes it." Reynolds shook his head. "The union is considering a vote of no confidence." Marcus had expected this, but the reality of it still stung. "That's too right. But my duty is to this entire community, not just the officers who feel comfortable with the status quo." After Reynolds left, Marcus sat quietly for a moment, weighing the challenges ahead. The path he had chosen was difficult, but necessary. His phone rang again, and this time he answered it. "Chief Washington," he said. "Chief, it's Garcia. The new training protocols are ready for your review, and you should know, 10 officers have volunteered to join Brennan on the community engagement team." Marcus smiled for the first time that morning. 10. That's more than I expected. "Word is getting around about what Brennan did at the forum," Garcia explained. "It made an impression." 3 weeks later, the first major changes were implemented. All officers were now required to complete an expanded training program on bias recognition and cultural sensitivity. The new traffic stop protocols required officers to state the specific reason for each stop over their radios before approaching a vehicle, creating an immediate record. The most significant change, however, was the formation of the Community Advisory Board, a diverse group of citizens who would review policing data and provide feedback on department policies. The board had real power, with direct access to the chief and the ability to make public recommendations. Not everyone embraced these changes. During the first mandatory training session, a group of veteran officers sat with arms crossed, their skepticism evident in every eye roll and whispered comment. Sergeant Miller, a 15-year veteran, voiced what many were thinking. "So we're supposed to second-guess every decision now. That'll get officers killed." The training facilitator, a former FBI agent specializing in bias training, nodded calmly. "Actually, research shows that officers who take time to assess situations make safer decisions for themselves and civilians." From the back of the room, to everyone's surprise, Officer Brennan spoke up. 3 weeks ago, I would have agreed with Sergeant Miller, but I've been thinking about all the times I approached a vehicle with my hand near my weapon because the driver was black. Was that making anyone safer? Or was I creating danger where none existed?" The room fell silent as officers considered his words. Brennan continued, his voice gaining confidence. "This isn't about political correctness. It's about effective policing. If we're stopping the wrong people for the wrong reasons, we're wasting resources and missing actual threats." The change in Brennan surprised everyone, none more than Chief Washington, who watched from the doorway. The officer who had profiled him was now becoming an unexpected ally in changing department culture. Not every day brought progress. 6 weeks into the new initiatives, an anonymous letter circulated through the department, criticizing the changes and questioning Chief Washington's leadership. Some officers requested transfers. Others simply did the minimum required training while continuing their usual practices. But there were signs of positive change too. Traffic stop data began to show more equitable outcomes. Community complaints decreased, and officers like Brennan, who had embraced the changes, reported more positive interaction.